district, obviously, or college-educated people in a more upscale district, that they're going to turn out more. And so that's going to have more of an impact in the House. In a Senate race, where it's the entire state, it's more a question of intensity. Midterm elections, as opposed to presidential elections, people don't tend to turn out as much unless they're really energized. 2010, with the Tea Party movement and the aftermath of Obamacare, you saw Republicans really turn out. This year, in the opposition to Trump, it looked like Democrats were going to turn out, but now it looks like there's a backlash by Republicans, and particularly in Senate races, you're beginning to see a lot of those races begin to move either towards or in favor of the Republican candidates.
Well, it's a fascinating day and an impressive process to come, Chris. We'll look forward to seeing Fox News Sunday this Sunday for sure. Joe Manchin speaking now. Let's listen.
I saw that Senator Collins, I wanted, out of respect, I wanted to watch her give hers, and she has to do that. And I knew when I saw she was going to do that, I said, fine, I'll watch it. And I gave my reasons for my decision. Ours went out, and I make sure.
You can listen to the people here. Are you concerned about?
I'm very much concerned, basically, with the such things that people have to endure, and I'm very much concerned that we have to do something as a country. I had to deal with the facts I had in front of me.
Do you believe the allegations?
I just, I never thought of it basically 50-50, 52. What would have happened is I had to go and vote on the facts I had in front of me. If I had been in that position, I would have liked to have got this place back to normal procedure if I'd have had that.
So why did you wait for Collins to make her announcement before you made your announcement?
I think that was basically what I saw her announcement that she was going to say that she would do that.
But did you follow her? Did you decide to vote that way because she voted against?
No. I think everybody labeled it. And we all did. Since I was all
Murkowski not voting her party affect your decision? How does Senator Murkowski voting no affect your decision at all, creating
Senator,
a
why are you betraying women?
Senator Murkowski was a very good friend of mine.
I know this is very hard to hear, folks, over the protesters, but this is the only Democratic senator who is going to end up voting for Brett Kavanaugh. Joe Manchin, if the audio gets better from him and he can be heard over the chanters who are very upset about his decision to go ahead and support the judge, the only Democrat to do so, we'll go back to that. But suffice it to say, he said he was very impressed with Susan Collins' decision to support the judge and a rationale behind that. Welcome, everybody. I'm Neil Cavuto, and this is Your World. And now we have, well, what appears to be some closure to a vote that could make it all official tomorrow. That is, Brett Kavanaugh has now the support of a majority of senators, where he can be assured that Montana Senator Steve Daines, the Republican whose daughter is getting married tomorrow, does not have to leave the church and fly back to Washington to close the deal. Enough votes are there with 50 of the 51 Republicans in the United States supporting the judge and one Democrat to boot. There will be no need to call the father of the bride. Let's go to Mike Emanuel on Capitol Hill with the latest on how all of this is falling out. Michael.
Neil, good afternoon. Events breaking in real time there. You have West Virginia's Democrat Joe Manchin after a lengthy floor speech from Senator Susan Collins saying he's a yes. Senator Collins went through in a very detailed speech, about 45 minutes or so, over the past hour, going through cases that Judge Kavanaugh had decided and why she thought he made the right decision. Had gone through the allegations coming from Christine Blasey Ford and was very careful in terms of saying she was supportive of Christine Blasey Ford and thought some people close to Christine Blasey Ford had not treated her properly. But in the end, Susan Collins, Republican of Maine, says she is a yes on Judge Kavanaugh. Take a listen.
The allegations fail to meet the more likely than not standard. Therefore, I do not believe that these charges can fairly prevent Judge Kavanaugh from serving on the court.
So that a critical yes vote, as is West Virginia's Joe Manchin. The only Republican that we're not aware of at this point is Lisa Murkowski of Alaska, who voted earlier today no. As for Democrats, they've all basically been no's except for Senator Manchin. Take a listen to this.
I hope that all my colleagues vote their conscience. Obviously, I'm concerned that the investigation was not thorough. There were many, many witnesses who we've heard from reports from their attorneys that they asked to be interviewed and were not interviewed.
This has clearly been a roller coaster since the very beginning of this Kavanaugh confirmation process. Barring any breaking developments, Judge Kavanaugh should be confirmed to the United States Supreme Court about 24 hours from now. Neil?
All right. Thank you very, very much, Mike. We are still monitoring some of these other senators coming and going right now. It might just be a little moot point. As I said, the votes have been secured that not even the Vice President of the United States is going to be needed to break a tie here. Of course, looking at the Well of the Heart building here, where a lot of these protests have been going on, some expressing extreme disappointment and shouting down, for example, Senator Manchin moments ago when he made it very clear that he was going to be a yes vote, only Democrat to vote yes on Brett Kavanaugh. And that sent a lot of protesters, into, heat and angst that a key moment has been missed. Kristen Fisher in Washington with much more on that and how this is all sorting out. Kristen.
Yeah, that was quite a moment, Neil, which we just all watched live together. All those protesters shouting, shame, 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 as Senator Joe Manchin, the red state Democrat, says that he is going to vote yes to confirm Kavanaugh. And we've been seeing things like that all over Capitol Hill today. Outside Senator Susan Collins' office, there have been protesters staked out all day long. 10 were just arrested about an hour ago, and at almost exactly the same time, while she was speaking on the Senate floor, there were more protesters interrupting her while she was speaking, while she was trying to make her case for why she's going to vote yes for Kavanaugh tomorrow. Listen to this.
Senator Collins, please vote no. Hire a voter from
The senator will suspend. The sergeant at arms will suspend until this. The sergeant at arms will restore order in the gallery. Sergeant.
And there have literally been hundreds of protesters chasing around these senators around Capitol Hill, staked outside their offices. I believe about 300 of them were arrested yesterday. We know of 10 arrested today outside Senator Susan Collins' office. Right now, you're looking at the scene outside another key swing senator's office, Jeff Flake. So the anti-Kavanaugh protesters have been absolutely massive, but there, of course, have been plenty of pro-Judge Kavanaugh supporters here, too. And we, of course, caught up with some of them. Listen to what one of those protesters had to say.
Because his credibility is spot on. I believe he is a man of God. I believe he is appointed and chosen by God.
But there is just so much emotion on both sides of this issue, Neil. You know, it's hard to just walk around the halls of the Capitol without running into a few protesters on either side. They've been doing their best to try to sway these critical swing senators. But, Neil, it seems that most of these senators have already made up their minds, and it's looking like Judge Kavanaugh will indeed get that confirmation vote that he needs tomorrow. Neil?
All right, Kristen, I'm sure you, certainly I've never seen anything like this entire saga. Kristen Fisher on Capitol Hill. Let's go to Indiana Republican Senator Todd Young. He says he is a firm yes vote on Judge Kavanaugh. Senator, very good to have you.
Thanks for having me, Neil.
Were you surprised that it came down to the wire like this with a couple of key senators who were holdouts in the end, and then to Susan Collins, and then after that capping it with one lone Democratic supporter in Joe Manchin?
Well, you know, this issue from the beginning has been one that has divided people based on the type of jurisprudence they want from a justice. And frankly, it's divided the nation as well. I wasn't surprised. I know that senators like Senator Collins and Flake and others have taken their responsibilities very, very seriously. They felt like they needed more time to make a final determination as to how they would cast their votes. And I think that is right and proper under the incredibly unique circumstances we had here. I will say that the process itself was unbecoming of the United States Senate. The American people deserve better. This is something that Senator Collins acknowledged when I presided over the Senate just moments ago when she delivered her riveting speech. And my hope moving forward is that we can, as she said, develop a more perfect union coming out of this process, recognizing that perhaps we've hit rock bottom.
You know, Senator, we're getting some tweets from some pretty famous Republicans, George H.W. Bush among them, saying of Senator Collins' political courage and class, I salute my wonderful friend and her principled leadership. There are already Democrats saying, as you know, sir, that this is going to cost you guys at the polls just about a month from now. What do you say?
Well, I can speak to the state of Indiana, and perhaps it's a bellwether for some other states. Indiana, as someone who just campaigned back in 2016, was looking for faithful constitutionalists to serve on the federal bench. Neil Gorsuch and now Brett Kavanaugh have certainly fitted that mold, and they're going to be supportive on balance for Brett Kavanaugh. They're certainly going to be excited back home about this decision by Susan Collins, myself, and others who have decided to support Brett Kavanaugh to sit on the Supreme Court of the United States. And my reading of this is that Republicans will certainly be fired up about this result. I'm glad, however, that so many of my colleagues obviously didn't make their decision based on political calculation, but instead, as Susan Collins did, instead on deep study, conviction, and just trying to do what's right for her state and for the American people more generally.
Also, Senator, we're getting word from the White House. This is not coming from the president himself, but from Sarah Sanders, tweeting, thank you, talking about Senator Collins for standing by your convictions and doing the right thing to confirm Judge Kavanaugh. Separately from Mitch McConnell on the Collins speech itself, it was an extraordinary speech, one of the best I've ever heard. It came at the right time. Now, he had met with the senator earlier today. I guess he had no way of knowing for sure how she would ultimately come down on this, but that he was optimistic. Where does the party go from here, given the relative closeness? And you dismissed talk as of other Republicans that this is going to cost them at the polls. If anything, it might have galvanized Republicans. We hear from Democrats it's galvanizing Democrats, but there are sort of battered feelings on both sides now. Where do you think everybody goes from here?
Well, of course, people will continue to campaign and make the argument for their respective candidacies and for those in their party. But as we step out of election season, it is my firm hope, and it's my personal commitment to, wherever possible, work with people across the aisle whenever those policies will advance the best interests of the American people. There is too much tribalism. There's too much partisanship here in Washington, D.C. We ought to have our allegiances. We ought to stand firmly on principle. But we also ought to make principled compromises wherever we can to advance the best interests of the American people. I think that Senator Collins, in her speech, provided just the sort of message that is required. Again, a more perfect union. That's what we're all seeking, I hope, Republican and Democratic alike. We should not be intimidated into making decisions that we wouldn't otherwise make because of special interest groups. And this was a good day for our Republican constitutional democracy today.
Senator Young, thank you very, very much. I know it's been a crazy week for you. It's going to be a crazier weekend. Best of luck on all fronts. Senator Todd Young of Indiana. By the way, we did tell you right now that there is one Democrat who's going to be supporting Brett Kavanaugh, the only Democrat, and that is Joe Manchin of West Virginia. So he completes a list of unknowns where we have it now official that Susan Collins is going to be a yes. We've reported that Jeff Flake is a likely yes on here. Lisa Murkowski, remember, she voted against ending closure. Some people have read into that, and statements she's had since that she will be a likely no. But back to Senator Manchin, his opponent in that senatorial race, Pat Morrissey, the Attorney General of the state, has said that Joe Manchin only votes in the interest of Joe Manchin. President Trump had all the votes he needed to confirm Judge Brett Kavanaugh, but Manchin waited, making a craven political calculation in order to try to save his political career. Be that as it may, a yes is a yes for Brett Kavanaugh, and whatever the motivation, the lone Democrat supporting him in this effort will be Joe Manchin, who's already up in the polls right now, depending on which one you watch, by a little or a lot, and whether that has sort of finalized the deal for him in West Virginia. Anyone's guess. Let's go to pollster Frank Luntz from Charleston, West Virginia. Frank, what do you think of that?
Well, in driving here from the airport, we saw several protests, and all of them were against Brett Kavanaugh, and all of them were calling on Joe Manchin to switch his attention and cast a vote in favor of actually against Brett Kavanaugh, and obviously he's not going to do that.
Those processes struck me as unusual in a state that Donald Trump won very, very big and all of that. Were they anomalies, or what do you think?
They're anomalies, but you have to. But in looking at this across the country, the heat is against Kavanaugh. The intensity, when you go to those people who are most angry and most likely to show up at a protest, most likely to carry around signs, it is female more than male, and it is hostile to Kavanaugh more than supportive. And that's why people may be getting the wrong impression. If you watch the news broadcasts across the dial, you'll see far more commentary against Kavanaugh than in favor of him, even though the polling is pretty close to 50-50.
What happens now in that state? He had a comfortable lead. Again, I understand, Frank, in some polls, and they vary in others. But that this looked on the part of Senator Manchin to be a bit of a craven opportunity here. But he probably was looking at the map there, and even though he might have been up in some polls by a good amount, you don't want to risk that, right?
Yeah, but I don't think that's fair. He now has to go to his Senate caucus, his Democratic caucus, every week and look his colleagues in the eye, being the only one of them that voted in favor of Judge Kavanaugh. That is not an easy thing, Neil, for him to do. And he's always been a guy who's been willing to buck the establishment, buck the leadership. One would argue that he'd be more comfortable in the Republican Party than he would be in the Democratic Party. And who knows, maybe this is yet another step, maybe another step in potentially re-examining where his partisanship lies.
You know, you're not the first to mention that, he's more Republican than Democrat or whatever. It's a tricky wicket for him, but that he might jump parties if the Democrats make things tough for him, which might be a reason why Chuck Schumer has had a sort of a hands-off approach.
Brian, I'm listening to the background and saying my commentary and yelling, screaming. I will tell you this, both sides have looked awful. Both sides have lost credibility. The American people do not deserve this kind of ugliness when we're trying to make important policy, ideological, constitutional decisions. I think that in this, we're going to talk about winners and losers over the next 96 hours. I think the American people are actually the loser in all of this based on what has happened. And listening to those protests and seeing people screaming, that's not how a democracy is supposed to function. And I think it's a pretty, you can say what you want about the conclusion, but our democracy is in genuine trouble right now.
A lot of Democrats have promised there will be hell to pay up for the judge, that if he makes it to the Supreme Court, they'll make life difficult for him. Some have even talked up about trying to impeach the guy. Where will any of that go? What will life be like if he makes it to the court for, an associate justice, Brett Kavanaugh?
I think it's going to be difficult for everyone, but frankly, you have the position to speak out at times when it's not difficult for you, and you still have spoken. There are individuals in Washington, D.C. that have the courage of their convictions, and I think that Judge Kavanaugh is one of them, that will not be intimidated by these political forces. But make no mistake, they're out there, they are strong, they seek to be heard, and most importantly, they seek to have impact. Instead of doing it for the country, they're doing it for their own narrow objectives, and I think that that's a tragedy.
It's very quiet outside the Supreme Court, I believe. And Pam, is this a live shot I'm looking at here? For those of you listening on radio, we're looking outside the Supreme Court here. And nothing like the crowds we were seeing leading up to this very day, maybe recognizing it's already going to be official on that. It's just a matter of cementing it tomorrow, that Brett Kavanaugh, and perhaps one of the closest votes we've ever seen for Supreme Court justice, will nevertheless make it to the high court. What kind of reception is he likely to get, do you think, Frank, from his fellow justices?
Well, the justices don't play politics. They have very strong points of view. But look at the strongest relationships. You have, in fact, the closest friendships are often between people like Justice Scalia, former Justice Scalia, and Ruth Bader Ginsburg, that they can agree to disagree harshly in the court and behind closed doors. But privately, they still have a collegial relationship, a respectful relationship. And I'm pretty convinced that Judge Kavanaugh, when he becomes a justice, will face that same kind of collegiality, that same kind of respect that is afforded to every member of the Supreme Court, left or right.
You hope, right? The reason why I ask it is, of course, Justice John Paul Stevens, a retired justice, 98 years young, who was mentioning yesterday that he doesn't think, as much as he respects Judge Kavanaugh, belongs on the court. I think it was referring to his intemperate remarks last week. Now, the judge went on to explain in a Wall Street Journal editorial today that there was a reason for that, and he was speaking as much for his daughters and his wife as he was anyone else who thought these allegations were true, that he was outraged and he responded accordingly. That was not enough to register, obviously, for John Paul Stevens, but I'm wondering how that will register for those who follow the court and every single opinion he has.
Well, it's going to register with the American people that I do believe Judge Kavanaugh will not be given a fair shake from those who have opposed him, that he will never be considered legitimate by the 40% of America that was against him from the very moment that he was appointed. That's a given. The question is whether he can do his job effectively, whether he abides by the Constitution. And if he does those things, I do believe not only will his colleagues accept him, but so will the majority of the American people. But Neil, it is going to be ugly. It's going to be ugly between now and Election Day. You're going to have the worst ads. You're going to have the worst dialogue back and forth between people. It's almost enough to make you want to just tune it all out, but you can't. Our democracy is too important.
All right, so very quickly and finally, is this going to move the needle on Election Day? In other words, the popular consensus was, well, he's risky, as you reminded me over these many years, that it would help Democrats if it looked like he was going to make it to the court. It would help Republicans if it looked like he would not make it to the court. So now this puts the advantage in Democrats' hat. What do you think?
I think that they were going to vote anyway. I think we had this huge turnout gap as recently as 10 days ago where every Democrat was going to vote and only some Republicans. What has happened in the last 10 days is that Republicans have realized that the courts matter and that if Donald Trump has a Democratic Senate, he will not be able to appoint a single member of the court from that point on. That has energized Republicans, and I now think it will have an electoral impact in November. Republicans are more likely to keep the Senate. And maybe they have an outside shot now of keeping the House.
That's very interesting. All right, Frank, always good seeing you. Thank you very much. Frank Luntz, a lot of you want to know why we were cutting away before from Senator Manchin. It was not a bias. It was as we couldn't hear. No one could hear him over the protest there. But we did get a transcript of some of those remarks he had made to reporters, that he referring to Senator Murkowski, of course, of Alaska. She's a good friend of mine. We all came to different conclusions. The reports are, by the way, that Senator Murkowski will end up being a no vote on this. We don't know until tomorrow for sure, but it looks that way. Went on to say that I came to my conclusion this morning when I went through another hour and a half. I believe something happened to Dr. Ford. I don't believe the facts showed, referring to Brett Kavanaugh, that he did it. I've had people all over West Virginia come forward and the trauma they went to, and I sympathize with that trauma they went through. That was something that Susan Collins echoed, that she definitely believes that something happened to Dr. Ford, and she takes Dr. Ford at her word that it was a horrendous personal event. But in the end, she found no proof that the person behind that was Brett Kavanaugh. And ultimately, that is why Susan Collins said she would end up being a yes vote, and why now it looks like a significant majority. All you need is one. All right, I said before, and it might have just seemed like a weird statement, more than he needed, a significant majority. All you needed was one more vote than you actually needed, and that's what Brett Kavanaugh got today, or when he got the support of Susan Collins from Maine, a Republican, and then to ice the cake, he got the support apparently of Joe Manchin of West Virginia, the Democrat, and that was enough to negate the need for getting Steve Daines, the senator from Montana, who has already announced that he is supporting Brett Kavanaugh to stay in Montana and go to his daughter's wedding tomorrow and give her away. He won't have to hop on a plane and come back to vote, because as things stand right now, nor with this number, you do not need the vice president to do any tiebreaker role here. Nevertheless, it will be one of the closest votes in American history for Supreme Court justice, rivaling and maybe even more significant than that, that had Clarence Thomas winning. I think back then in 1991, it was a 52-48 vote, but that was in a Democratic Senate, so significant at the time. Let's get a read on now with former White House Deputy Chief of Staff Karl Rove. What do you think, Karl?
It was an historic day today, and it will be an historic vote tomorrow. Not necessarily tomorrow a great day for America, because we've seen over the last nearly 20 years, increasing polarization over the Supreme Court. Back when Bill Clinton nominated Ruth Bader Ginsburg, 94% of Republicans supported her confirmation. 75% of Republicans supported Clinton's nomination of Stephen Breyer. 50% of Democrats supported John Roberts' nomination by George W. Bush. Only 10% of Democrats supported Alito. And tomorrow, 1 out of 49 Democrats will support the nomination of Brett Kavanaugh. That's a sad day for America.
I'm wondering what the political fallout will be. You hear from Democrats who are saying, if this guy gets in, that's going to help us. You heard Republicans fearing that if he didn't get in, the same thing in reverse, that it was going to help them. How does that all fall out?
Well, we've had a couple of pieces of information this week about how it is settling out, and that is the Harvard-Harris poll and the National Public Radio poll both indicated that Republican enthusiasm to vote in the fall elections has jumped dramatically in the last month. For example, in the NPR poll, it went from the Democrats were 78% considered the election to be very important, to 68% for Republicans. It's now today 82 for Democrats, 80 for Republicans, up 4 for Democrats, and up 12 for Republicans. So it's clearly given a bigger bump for Republicans. My sense is that there's going to be a small, well, I don't know how small, but there's going to be a relatively small negative impact for the Democrats after this. You may have seen that letter recently from sort of 10 large left-wing groups inside the Democratic orbit who sent a letter to Schumer saying, if you can't stop Kavanaugh, we're going to hold you personally responsible. So my sense has always been whoever loses this vote is going to see an impact. I think it'll be modest, but it could be in some races dispositive because we're going to have a lot of very close contests, particularly in purple states and purple districts.
Would it still be a good idea to have Mike Pence around, though, tomorrow? I mean, his vote technically wouldn't be necessary. I guess it's 51-48 now if you view that Steve Daines from Montana doesn't have to leave his daughter's wedding. But how does this play out?
Well, I do think you want to have the vice president standing by. This, back in when we had a 50-50 Senate, in the early days of the Bush administration, the vice president was constantly up on the Hill on even procedural matters. And look, what we're going to have is 48 Democrats voting no. We're going to have, it looks like, 50 Republicans voting yes, minus Daines. So we'll have 49 Republicans president voting yes, and one other giving his daughter away at her wedding, and then Manchin. So we will have 50 to 49 is going to be the vote. So, yeah, you want to have the vice president standing by in the event a Republican gets caught in traffic or somehow unable to vote, and it's a 49-49 tie.
Now, of course, they have 30 hours of debate. We're about, 5 or so hours into that. Do you think they use that full amount of time?
I would suspect they might, because the Democrats are going to do everything they can to sort of talk about this and to occupy time and delay. The Senate used to be a place of real debate. We remember as school children learning about, Daniel Webster, the Webster-Haynes debate over nullification, and these great, Henry Clay and these great champions of America having debates. That's died away. But I got to tell you, in the mid 50s, a woman senator from Maine, Margaret Chase Smith, gave a famous speech that began the end of Joe McCarthy's influence in the Senate and in American politics. And today we saw another Republican woman from Maine give an extraordinary speech. That was riveting. It was thoughtful. It was clearly she had given a great deal of consideration of what she wanted to say and how she said it. We're going to spend a lot of time to how she dealt with the questions of sexual assault allegations. But the first part of the speech was a methodical review of the charges made about Brett Kavanaugh. And we saw there Susan Collins dealing with them. Here's what the charge was, and here's how she had reviewed and investigated and come to a different conclusion than the charge. I thought it was a masterful speech and one of those rare moments where a speech on the floor was substantive and thoughtful and dealt with a difficult issue and may not influence minds inside the Senate given the partisanship there, but it's certainly, I think, going to influence the minds of those that watched it on television.
No, she did lay it out beautifully. I'm thinking of, I'm a real conservative. I heard what she had to say about precedent and Roe v. Wade and all of that, where I might be scratching my head and say, whoa, what did you say?
Yeah. Yeah, well, she was methodical about it.
Absolutely.
And she clearly explored these questions with Kavanaugh when she met with him. Remember, she met with him for an hour after the issue came up about sexual assault charges, but she had previously met with him and methodically gone over his judicial record. Look, I've known her a long time. I have enormous respect for her and affection for her, but she has approached this in a very serious fashion and set out to arrive at her own conclusions.
Well put, as were her remarks. Thank you very much, Karl Rove. And speaking of Senator Collins, we are understanding right now, and she is telling reporters, I came to my conclusions last night. She made up her mind All right, it's never over until it's officially over, and a lot of things could still happen, even though the numbers seem to add up ever so barely. For Brett Kavanaugh, Fox News senior producer, Capitol Hill producer, joins us right now, Chad Pergram. Chad, what's next here?
Well, the next thing will be the vote sometime tomorrow afternoon, unless they yield back time. We're burning what they call in the Senate post-cloture time. They voted to end debate earlier this morning, and after that you get 30 hours, and that means that the confirmation vote, unless there's an agreement to go back and take the vote early, which sometimes happens, in fact it happens quite often, would be at about 4:52 Eastern time tomorrow afternoon. As I've said for many days, it's about the math, it's about the math, it's about the math. So what we're looking at right now is a confirmation vote that's either going to be 51-49 or 50-49. The question is whether or not Republican Steve Daines of Montana will be there. Now, he indicated yesterday that he would come back to Washington. His daughter is getting married in Montana, and if his vote was necessary, he would come back into town, and they might keep the vote open. That doesn't seem to be the case. So right now, at a minimum, the vote's probably going to be 51-49, with Collins and Manchin voting yes. If Daines is not present, it would be 50-49. Now, right after Susan Collins concluded her remarks, Neil, I spoke with the Senate Majority Leader, Mitch McConnell, as he was coming off the floor. He was all smiles, frankly, and he said this to me about Collins' speech. It was an extraordinary speech, one of the best I've ever heard. It came at the right time. And that's what happens when you get close to these big votes. Senators start to make up their minds. Susan Collins indicated to my colleague Jason Donner just a little bit ago that she decided how she was going to vote last night, Neil.
You know, the 50-49 thing, since there are only 99 senators present, you don't need a majority. Well, I mean a majority if you had 100 senators, right? So the vice president wouldn't be necessary. It could be a 50-49 vote. That would make it the closest vote in Supreme Court judging history, wouldn't it?
Right, yeah, those are pretty tight. I mean, Clarence Thomas was confirmed 52-48, but you don't get style points. Somebody doesn't get, seated on the court and there's a little asterisk, it was wind assisted like in the Olympics or something. Either you're on the court or you're not.
Now, that's a very good point. Of course, in Clarence Thomas' case, it was remarkable that I believe that was the Democratic Senate, 52-48. Now everyone talks about the fallout from all of this. What do you think?
Well, people are saying, which side is this going to energize the most? There are some who are thinking that it's certainly going to energize, Democrats. And in the House races, it's unclear how it might play in the Senate races. And, another barometer is look at all the demonstrations here on Capitol Hill. Are people going to lash out at Jeff Flake and Susan Collins? Does this actually help Joe Manchin? Joe Manchin among those Democratic senators from swing states who have competitive reelection bids this fall. He was doing the best of any of those. West Virginia is serious Trump country, and it's not like everybody backs off of Joe Manchin all of a sudden. The point is that Joe Manchin is doing pretty well, and this probably helped him in his reelection bid. A dumb question on my part, but you endure them time and again, my friend. But, I mean, it's not official until it's official. It's not official until they make a vote. We learned that from Jeff Flake when it looked like he would be a yes, get a vote out of committee, which he did, and but with a proviso that an FBI investigation had to be done over the next week. Is there any chance that something changes, that, for example, Lisa Murkowski, who looks like a no, is a yes, that a Jeff Flake, who looks like a yes, is a no, that kind of stuff? You know, you never rule anything out. We had a fire drill last night that there was some suggestion that Cory Gardner, Republican senator from Colorado, was in play. That's certainly not the case. He asserted, you know, he's been for Kavanaugh since he was a couple weeks after he was nominated back in July. We had the unexpected news last night with Daines. That changed the matrix a little bit. What would they have to do? What efforts might they have to take to get him here to vote? You know, you never nail it down until it's done. It ain't over till it's over, is a great baseball scion once said.
So on Daines, just to be very clear, they could always fly him back, but is there a limit time-wise to how much they allowed to keep a vote open?
Absolutely not. I mean, it's up to Mitch McConnell when they decide to vote. When he decides to close the vote, they close the vote. The record length for a roll call vote in the Senate was set on the stimulus package in February of 2009. Sherrod Brown, Democratic senator from Ohio, left to go to Cleveland. His mother had passed away. They held the vote open for 5 hours and 15 minutes. Brown's vote was essential to passing the stimulus package. They needed 60 yeas. The vote was 60-38. He came in and voted, and they passed the stimulus bill. It's up to Mitch McConnell how long they keep that vote open.
Chad, thank you, my friend. Chad Berger.
My pleasure.
All right, we're going to get the read from the White House. This looks like the second big victory for the President of the United States. Neil Gorsuch was big enough, but this was an even harder fought battle. If it goes as planned, he's got 2. Outside the Supreme Court right now, we're surprised to see the crowds that were there a little more than 24 hours ago are not there, whether this sort of punctured a balloon where they thought they could topple a nomination. By historical numbers, it's as close as anything could get, but it does look, as we've indicated here, with the moves of some key votes today, that Brett Kavanaugh is on his way to becoming a Supreme Court Associate Justice. You know, when all is said and done, in the end, you could probably thank Mitch McConnell for that. Not only was he able to orchestrate, I think what he did with Merrick Garland, putting off that Barack Obama nomination and then setting the stage for Neil Gorsuch, who ended up being a major win for Republicans, for Donald Trump in particular. But Mitch McConnell really made that happen, and he stood by and with the process and understanding the rules and agreeing to this investigation on the part of the FBI and keeping wayward members happy. I don't think enough has been said about the Republican leader and how instrumental he was in not only this nomination, certainly the prior one. Of course, it helped to have a president of the United States who put forth the names he did. But Mitch McConnell had to make it happen. And boy, this one was as dicey as they come, and through clear grit and savviness about how to use the institution to your advantage, he made it happen. Again, we don't want to pop the champagne corks, as a lot of Republicans are doing right now on this nomination. But if it does come to pass, and it looks like it will come to pass, it was Mitch McConnell who sort of cleared the roadway here to make sure it did. All right, from the White House, Blake Berman on their reaction. Blake.
Neil, at about the 35-minute mark earlier today of the Susan Collins speech, I reached out to a White House official who has been very instrumental in this Kavanaugh process to get reaction on the speech. And this person simply responded to me the following, saying, quote, "This speech is outstanding." A very big relief over here at the White House today. In fact, Sarah Sanders on Twitter just echoed that by writing on Twitter the following, quote, "Thank you, Senator Collins, for standing by your convictions and doing the right thing to confirm Judge Kavanaugh." The White House was very confident earlier this morning that this process would end up in its favor. Then there was the procedural vote that looked that way as well. And now with the apparent thumbs up from Susan Collins and the senator from West Virginia as well, Joe Manchin, it is almost a definite at this point, and they are, no doubt about it, celebrating and relieved here. This couldn't have ended up any better for this White House when you think about it, Neil, because the process ended, or at least on this day ended, with Susan Collins going to the Senate floor, the entire political world watching her, and for about 45 minutes she laid out step by step by step many of the arguments that this White House and Republicans were making for Judge Brett Kavanaugh. We still have not yet received official reaction from President Trump, but we have from the former president, George H.W. Bush. He wrote the following on Twitter just a little while ago, quote, "Senator Collins' political courage and class. I salute my wonderful friend and her principled leadership." Brett Kavanaugh is thought of very highly within the Bush orbit. Of course, he was the former staff secretary to President Bush 43. Neil?
We are also hearing, my friend, from Chuck Grassley, who is saying that I think Senator Collins, referring to her remarks, the Maine senator, in the same spirit, did more to expose the ugliness of the controversy around the Kavanaugh nominating process than any other senator. I commend Senator Collins for her thoughtfulness, and I'm proud to have her support for such a well-qualified nominee. And if you think about it, Senator Collins went out of her way to say the release of this letter from Dr. Ford, she just strongly believes, with her fondness for Senator Feinstein, it didn't come from Senator Feinstein.
Right.
She also reached across the partisan divide on issues like Roe v. Wade to say, you've got this guy pegged wrong. I mean, he's more pragmatic than you think. He's less sort of precedent ignoring than you think. She really did lay out a different view and a rationale for supporting him. Not that it necessarily moved a lot of minds, but a crucial couple.
There were three sort of chapters, I guess, if you want to say, considering the length of this speech. The first was Brett Kavanaugh's judicial record and his judicial career, and she sort of laid out a handful of different instances and concerns that some might have, and said, in her estimation, why those should not be viewed as concerns. That was kind of the first part. The second part was the allegations that were leveled by Dr. Christine Blasey Ford, and Collins said how she believed that Dr. Ford was sexually assaulted at some point, but she also said how it didn't necessarily reach a standard of proof, or at least reach a certain level as to drawing a line between that and Judge Kavanaugh. And she said, there is beyond a reasonable doubt in the court system. She didn't think that this is necessarily a court system, but in her estimation, she could not necessarily meet that threshold, I guess you could say, and that was part of one of the reasons that she was citing to go for giving the thumbs up to Brett Kavanaugh. That was sort of the second chapter. And then the third was this letter in which she gave a speech as to whoever came forward and sort of exposed Dr. Ford, or at least broke the confidentiality that Dr. Ford sought after. It was a scathing criticism, Neil, from Susan Collins, saying that person should be ashamed of what they did.
Yeah,
Neil?
and it's how she wove that into her rationale and a well-reasoned argument. It really was remarkable. As are you, Blake. Thank you very, very much, my friend. Outside the White House, Blake Berman. Let's go to Sean Spicer, of course, his best-selling book, The Briefing, of course, a former top spokesman for the White House, much, much more. Sean, what did you think of how this day ended?
Well, I think it ended the way that everyone on the Republican side and at the White House wanted it to. It took a lot longer than folks thought it probably did. It got a lot messier, and I think Karl Rove is right. I think the process itself is extremely disappointing for both sides. This is no way to run a railroad, as they say. But I think that the White House persevered. The White House Office of Legislative Affairs deserves a lot of credit for staying in touch with these members of Congress, of the Senate, and making sure that they had their pulse on where things were going. I think overall the strategy that the White House employed the last few days, their temperament, their responses, their output was exactly right. And they let the process play out in a way that it should. And we got to the right outcome. And it looks like, as you point, let's not pop the champagne bottles, but by all accounts, it looks as though Brett Kavanaugh is about to be confirmed as the next Associate Justice.
Sean, I think an unsung hero in all of this is Mitch McConnell. And you know the labyrinth and the procedures and the quirkiness of the United States Senate and the rules and everything else. But if there's anyone who knows that arcane system better than anyone, and it frustrated the President of the United States, who didn't understand it. It frustrated a lot of folks, as it continues to, with the House that is a far more simple process of up or down votes, and you don't need majorities or supermajorities or committee calls and the filibuster thing back and forth. But having said all that, the way he handled, Merrick Garland, of course, which forever earned him the contempt of Democrats, that he canceled a Supreme Court appointment in election year using that. And the Obama folks and President Obama himself railed against that. But it paved the way for Neil Gorsuch. Obviously, it paved the way for Brett Kavanaugh. And he shepherded that system because he knew it so well. What do you think?
I think you're absolutely right. There are Republicans and conservatives will have a 5-4 majority, a real 5-4 majority for the first time in decades because of two people. Donald Trump for putting forward a list of conservative jurists that will follow the Constitution, and Mitch McConnell for getting it through. You're absolutely right. I don't know that there's another person that has the skill, acumen, patience, and know-how to navigate the Senate in the way that Mitch McConnell did. And he did it with a steady hand, got the job done, as you can tell from the comments and the way that he's handled himself, he's not out there for the limelight and the shows. He knows how to navigate the Senate, and he knows his members better than anybody. And I think because of Donald Trump and Mitch McConnell, every conservative should be proud of the direction that this court, and not just this court, because the untold story is also what's happening at the circuit and appellate court levels as well. And that's because of Mitch McConnell, the way he's been running the Senate and prioritizing nominations. But I think there's no question in my mind, one of the biggest legacies that Donald Trump will have as president is the reshaping of the judiciary towards strict constructionalists, people who use the Constitution as a guidepost and not interpret it. And I think those two people, Donald Trump and Mitch McConnell, are people that every conservative should remember the teamwork that they have displayed in getting this done.
It is remarkable. You don't have to be right or left to realize how that 1-2 punch worked. They were odd bedfellows. I'm not saying the odd couple. I'm not saying who should play, Felix or Oscar, but I mean, it has worked. In a weird way, it has worked. And they both got frustrated with each other. They both had some acrimonious comments. We're told. I just know what I read. But it is interesting. But I think the unsung heroes in a lot of this, obviously, besides the President of the United States, is obvious. But the guy who has to shepherd it through his institution, and it is sometimes like herding cats, but that is Mitch McConnell. That's a remarkable achievement. Now the question going forward is whether this poisons the well for the midterms. You always hear this argument. It's going to galvanize the angry Democrats, and it will hurt Republicans, just as it would have been the reverse had it not gone this way for the Democrats. What do you think?
Well, I think, look, taking everything aside in terms of the process itself and the allegations, but looking at it purely through a political lens, I think the Democrats made a massive mistake in this process in the way that they handled themselves, because it's been pointed out they went into this month with a massive enthusiasm gap that benefited them heading into a crucial midterm. Republicans have closed that gap. I think for every Republican that's out there and doesn't understand the binary choice that exists this election, that understand the fact that Donald Trump's name might not be on the ballot, but his agenda and policies are, and that they need to go out and vote. These nominations, whether it's at the court or other levels, or the policies that are helping bring us to outstanding unemployment rates and economic growth, are all at jeopardy if we don't maintain a Republican House and Senate. And so this nomination galvanized it in a way that I don't know what else could have for so many Republican voters, independent voters, and right-leaning Democrats.
Well said. Sean Spicer, great catching up. Thank you very, very much.
Have a great weekend, Neil.
You too. By the way, we have Cory Booker right now on the wires. I think he tweeted out. Is this a tweet I'm reading, Pam? He said, we face defeat, but we are not defeated. Knocked down, but not knocked out. A loss, but all is not lost. Hope is the active conviction that despair will not ever have the last word. Wait a minute. That's from Spartacus. No, I'm kidding. It's not from Spartacus. We're also getting Michael Avenatti reaction to all of this, that he thinks it was a very unfair process. I'll get into the details of that in just a second. To the Washington Examiner's Kristen Solstice Anderson on all of this. How does this all sort out, you think, Kristen?
So I think when it comes to Kavanaugh himself, you find that polls show a very slim plurality of voters say that they would oppose versus confirm. But when you give voters the option to say they're unsure, they just don't know. This has been such a convoluted process. A pretty sizable chunk of the electorate just throws their hands up. And that's very unusual. I mean, most issues in the Trump era are pretty polarizing. People know where they fall on them. This nomination's been a little bit different because of all of the uncertainty and a sort of plague-o-both their houses view of how both parties in the Senate have handled the politics of the issue. Interestingly, in that Quinnipiac poll that showed, I think, +6 toward oppose versus confirm for Kavanaugh, you nonetheless had almost half of respondents say they feel Kavanaugh was treated unfairly in the process. And so there's just a lot of voters